The words formed in Cassius Clay's throat like bullets in a gun chamber. 3 syllables that would detonate in the cramped Louisville hotel conference room and send shockwaves through the comfortable world of sports journalism that had never heard anything like what was about to emerge in the mouth of a 20-year-old fighter who was supposed to know his place and keep quiet about his ambitions. The Brown Hotel's meeting room smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee, the institutional beige walls pressing in on a dozen white reporters who had driven from across Kentucky to hear what they assumed would be the usual modest pleasantries from another young boxer grateful for the opportunity to entertain them with his fists. The fluorescent lights hummed with electrical tension that seemed to anticipate the verbal explosion that was building behind Clay's perfectly aligned teeth. Clay stood behind a makeshift podium constructed from a folding table and a borrowed microphone, his 6'3" frame filling the space with a presence that somehow seemed too large for the modest surroundings. His hands rested lightly on the table's edge, but beneath the surface calm, energy coursed through his muscles like electricity through copper wire, seeking an outlet that would come in the form of words rather than punches. The reporters shuffled through their notes with the bored efficiency of men who had covered 1,000 similar events, their pens poised to record the predictable humility that the unwritten rules of athletic discourse demanded from fighters, especially young black fighters who were expected to express gratitude rather than ambition, deference rather than confidence, hope rather than certainty. Behind Clay, his trainer Angelo Dundee stood with the expression of a man who sensed something unprecedented was about to occur but couldn't predict its exact nature or consequences. He had worked with fighters for decades, had heard every possible variation of pre-fight boasting and psychological warfare, but something in Clay's demeanor suggested that whatever emerged from this press conference would transcend the usual boundaries of boxing promotion. The room's temperature had risen several degrees from the collective body heat of 20 people packed into a space designed for half that number, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and the kind of humid tension that preceded thunderstorms. Outside the hotel windows, Louisville traffic continued its mundane flow, unaware that inside this unremarkable conference room, the future of sports marketing was about to be revolutionized. Clay's breathing was controlled, measured, the inhalation and exhalation of a man who had discovered something about himself that others couldn't see, something that demanded expression regardless of the consequences. His Olympic gold medal, won in Rome just 2 years earlier, sat heavy in his memory, not as an achievement to be modest about, but as evidence of something larger, something that deserved to be proclaimed rather than whispered. The reporters' questions had been predictable, professional, designed to elicit the kind of responses that would fill column inches without challenging any assumptions about the natural order of athletic hierarchy. They asked about his training regimen, his upcoming fights, his gratitude for the opportunities that professional boxing had provided. Clay answered each question with increasing impatience, his responses growing shorter, more clipped, as if he were waiting for the right moment to detonate something that had been building pressure inside him for months. A veteran sports writer from the Louisville Courier-Journal adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat with the authority of a man who had covered Clay's amateur career and felt qualified to predict his professional trajectory. His question was delivered with a patronizing tone that older white men reserve for younger black athletes. "Cassius, what are your realistic expectations for your professional career?" The word realistic hung in the cigarette-heavy air like a challenge, like a limitation, like an attempt to fence at ambitions that had never learned to respect boundaries. Clay's eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening with the kind of tension that preceded explosive action. The question wasn't asking about his goals. It was asking him to accept limitations, to acknowledge the natural ceiling that others believed should constrain his aspirations. Clay's hands lifted from the table's surface, rising to shoulder height with the deliberate precision of a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra through a symphony that only he could hear. His fingers spread wide, then closed into fists, then opened again, as if he were physically grasping for the words that would capture something too large for conventional language, too revolutionary for the modest setting of a Louisville hotel conference room. The silence stretched between question and answer, filling with the kind of electric potential that made the fluorescent lights seem brighter, the cigarette smoke denser, the collective breathing of 20 people more audible. Clay's chest rose and fell with increasing rhythm, his body preparing to launch words with the same explosive force he generated in the boxing ring. Then, With the timing of a man who understood that history was made in moments of absolute conviction, Clay's voice cut to the tobacco-scented air with 3 words that would echo through decades of athletic self-promotion, sports marketing, and the gradual transformation of athletes from humble entertainers to global brands who understood the power of personality. I am the greatest. The words erupted from his throat with the force of a cannon blast, each syllable precisely enunciated, perfectly timed, delivered with a kind of absolute conviction that brooked no argument, no qualification, no humble modification. His voice carried across the cramped conference room and seemed to expand beyond its physical boundaries, filling space that extended far beyond the Brown Hotel, beyond Louisville, beyond the conventional limits of what young athletes were supposed to say about themselves. The effect on the assembled reporters was immediate and profound. Pens stopped moving mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Cigarettes burned unnoticed in ashtrays as their owners forgot to inhale. The comfortable rhythms of predictable sports journalism had been shattered by a declaration that violated every unwritten rule about athletic humility, racial deference, and the proper relationship between athletes and the media that covered them. The veteran reporter's glasses slipped down his nose as his mouth opened in involuntary shock, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard. In 30 years of covering sports, he had never encountered an athlete who spoke about himself with such absolute certainty, such complete absence of false modesty, such utter disregard for the social conventions that govern how young black men were supposed to present themselves to white audiences. Clay's declaration hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the entire establishment of American sports journalism. It was more than simple boasting. It was a fundamental rejection of the role that society had assigned him, a refusal to accept the limitations that others believed should constrain his self-perception, a revolutionary act disguised as athletic confidence. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, but those 7 seconds contained the sound of assumptions cracking, conventions crumbling, and the birth of something entirely new in the relationship between athletes and their public personas. Clay remained perfectly still during those seconds, his chin raised slightly, his eyes moving from face to face among the assembled reporters, reading their shock like a prize fighter reading an opponent's tells. Behind him, Angelo Dundee's expression showed a mixture of admiration and concern, the look of a man who recognized that his fighter had just stepped across a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed himself to a level of public scrutiny and expectation that would follow him for the rest of his career. But beneath the concern lay something else, the recognition that he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in professional sports. A younger reporter from the Associated Press found his voice first, his question emerging as a stammered challenge that carried undertones of disbelief. "You said you're the greatest." "The greatest what exactly?" His words suggested that perhaps Clay had misspoken, that clarification might reveal something more modest, more acceptable, more in line with conventional athletic discourse. Clay's response came without hesitation, his voice even stronger now, reinforced by the confidence that came from crossing a psychological threshold and discovering that the consequences were manageable. The greatest fighter that ever lived, the greatest heavyweight that ever lived, the greatest athlete in the world. Each superlative was delivered with increasing force, building to a crescendo that filled the conference room with energy that seemed to vibrate through the walls, the floor, the collective consciousness of everyone present. Clay wasn't just making predictions about his future success. He was declaring a present reality that existed independent of external validation, a self-perception so complete that it required no supporting evidence beyond his own conviction. The reporter's initial shock was beginning to transform into something more complex, a mixture of indignation, curiosity, and the gradual recognition that they were witnessing something that would generate headlines, controversy, and the kind of public attention that sold newspapers. Clay's declaration was more than sports news. It was cultural revolution delivered with perfect timing and absolute conviction. Notebooks flipped open with renewed urgency as reporters began scribbling quotes that they sensed would be remembered long after the details of his boxing matches were forgotten. The usual questions about training regimens and fight strategy seemed suddenly irrelevant compared to the larger story that was unfolding. The birth of an athlete who understood that personality was as important as performance, that controversy was more valuable than humility, that being talked about was more powerful than being liked. Clay's confidence seemed to grow with each passing second, fed by the energy of shock and attention that radiated from the assembled journalists. He had discovered something that would become the foundation of modern sports marketing, that audiences were hungry for athletes who transcended the traditional boundaries of their sports, who became larger than their athletic achievements through a force of personality and the courage to say what others only thought. "I'm not just confident," Clay continued, his voice now carrying the rhythm and cadence that would become his signature style. "I'm convinced. I know I'm the greatest because I feel I'm the greatest. I know I'm pretty because I'm pretty. And I know I'm going to be heavyweight champion of the world because that's what I was born to be." The logic was circular, self-reinforcing, immune to external contradiction because it originated from a source of internal certainty that required no validation from conventional authorities. Clay had discovered the power of absolute self-belief, the revolutionary concept that declaring greatness could be the first step toward achieving it. That confidence could be both cause and effect in the psychology of championship performance. The veteran reporter removed his glasses and cleaned them with shaking hands, a gesture that seemed less about improving his vision than about buying time to process what he was witnessing. The world of sports journalism that he had known for 3 decades was being transformed before his eyes by a young man who refused to follow the established scripts, who was writing new rules through the simple act of believing in himself without limitation or apology. "You realize," the veteran said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority that has shaped decades of athletic coverage, "that you haven't accomplished anything yet? You've had a few amateur fights, you won a gold medal, but you haven't faced any real professional competition. How can you claim to be the greatest when you haven't proven anything?" Clay's smile broadened, revealing teeth so perfect they seemed to have been designed for television cameras that didn't yet exist in most American homes. His response came with the timing of a comedian and conviction of a prophet. "I don't have to prove I'm the greatest. I just am. The proof will come later, but the greatness is already here." The statement inverted the traditional relationship between achievement and recognition, suggesting that true champions possessed their greatness before they demonstrated it, that external validation was merely confirmation of internal reality rather than its source. Clay was proposing a radical new model of athletic psychology that placed self-belief at the center of performance rather than treating it as the reward for success. Camera bulbs flashed as photographers captured the moment, their instincts telling them that this young fighter's words were creating something historically significant even if they couldn't yet understand its full implications. The images they were creating would become iconic representations of athletic confidence, visual evidence of the moment when sports promotion evolved from modest description to bold declaration. Clay's declaration reverberated beyond the conference room walls, rippling outward through telephone conversations, wire service reports, and the gradual realization among sports editors that this unknown fighter had created a story that transcended boxing, that touched on fundamental questions about race, class, ambition, and the American dream as interpreted by a young black man who refused to accept limitations that others considered natural and necessary. The questions continued for another 20 minutes. But the real story had been told in those first 3 words that shattered the comfortable assumptions of athletic discourse and announced the arrival of a new kind of athlete who understood that greatness was as much about perception as performance, as much about declaration as demonstration, as much about the courage to claim extraordinary status as the ability to achieve it through traditional means. As Clay left the podium and walked toward the exit, his movement carried the confidence of a man who had discovered something powerful about the relationship between belief and reality, between internal conviction and external achievement. He had learned that greatness could be proclaimed before it was proven, that confidence could be both the foundation and the result of extraordinary performance. The reporters remained in their seats for several minutes after Clay's departure, their collective silence speaking to the magnitude of what they had witnessed. They had come expecting to cover another routine sports story and instead had documented the birth of modern athletic self-promotion, the moment when an unknown fighter declared himself the greatest and began the process of making that declaration into reality through the sheer force of unwavering self-belief. The words, "I am the greatest," would echo through the remainder of Clay's career and beyond, becoming not just a prediction but a philosophy, not just a boast but a blueprint for how athletes could transcend their sports through the power of personality, conviction, and the revolutionary understanding that believing in greatness was the first step toward achieving it. In that Louisville hotel conference room, Surrounded by cigarette smoke and skeptical journalists, a young man had spoken 3 words that would change sports forever, proving that sometimes the most powerful punch is delivered with words rather than fists, with conviction rather than violence, with the courage to declare what others only dare to dream.